I want to take you all back to a moment that makes me feel ambivalent. It was Halloween, my favorite holiday. On a normal year, everything would be perfect. It would be a part of the year that makes me feel good, that makes me relish being on this planet in my element, the scary part of the year, full of monsters and goblins, when the veneer between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. Only, it wasn't just any Halloween. It was Halloween of 2020. Let's back up a bit. I did have some general things to be proud of at that point. My film festival at the time, Horrible Imaginings, it had just performed quite well under the circumstances. We had gone fully remote. After all, it was the most acute part of the COVID-19 pandemic. The email boxes were full of praise, both from filmmakers, from producers, from audience members, just telling about how well the film festival went, how they couldn't believe it was so engaging and fun, even though we weren't in person. We got people asking how we did it, other film festivals reaching out. So it should have been a high point in my life. And I guess it was, but it was also a real start, or my drop into the abyss was well on its way. So, because not only was the lockdown in full force, but we were under lockdown under the Trump administration. We were on lockdown at a time when the murder of Black residents and civilians at the hands of the police was not only extreme, but it was on display constantly. And it's all we had to watch because we were all at home to see it. It was the lockdown at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, of the protests, which I believe was a strong period in our history, but it was also a time when many people around the country felt free and open by calling Black Lives Matter protesters crisis actors or terrorists, or somehow worse, calling all lives matter as another way of kind of circumventing the point that Black people were being targeted at a greater rate by the police. But Miguel, you might ask, I can see how all of this is relevant in an episode about outrage, but what does that have to do with atheism? You have an atheist YouTube channel. So here, my friends, is one answer to that. And it also ties back to when everything started. So going back to Halloween 2020. My in-laws, they're fundamentalist Southern evangelical Baptists. And of course, this affected their politics. It influenced their politics. Now, as a family, up until that point, we had been strictly adhering to the CDC guidelines about masking, sheltering in place. I kind of want to talk about that to get it out of the way for people suggesting that my eventual nervous breakdowns, my mental health related problems, that all of that was not related to anything external, that it was all in my head. Well, it's a little bit of both, right? The person I am is now the person I largely was like in my 20s. I never grew out of wanting to stay out all night, hanging out with friends, going to see bands that were faster and louder, or seeing marathons of films that went for 12 or even 24 hours, hanging out with clans of my people. I get my life and my energy and my love by being surrounded by those people. I'm the extreme opposite of a homebody. And to say that I'm an extrovert, that's kind of a watered down simplification, but I do think it's appropriate for this episode. I will explore more deeply why I am the way I am in the future. But just saying extrovert is worth noting for this time because there are some studies that show that the pandemic was worse for extroverts. And that seems to bear out anecdotally for me, for my friends and other things. It was very hard for me, the lockdown. But when I was still doing a festival and I would ask how people were handling it, it was the self-proclaimed introverts who'd be like, the pandemic was great. It really worked. I got to do my art. I got to write my scripts more. I got to do this, that. I don't like being around people anyway. And I've heard this a lot in other conversations with other introverts. And in fact, the internet is a very introvert friendly platform. So it can seem like the entire world feels that way. And it can feel very lonely if someone is an extrovert and sees like all the introvert memes and stuff, but there's very little to acknowledge how we feel, how the pandemic and lockdown was not only a time of huge traumatic difficulty, but how some of us were utterly destroyed by it. And I would say that I came very close to being completely destroyed by the pandemic. So that's part of it. I wanted to acknowledge that trauma plays a big part in this, but it's not every part. I was primed, right? I was primed for mental health problems. I was primed for a mental health collapse, in fact. But I also want to say that that doesn't invalidate that I was reacting against genuinely harmful things that I saw in society, things going on in the world, things going on in our country with the terrible leadership we had up until that point. And the source of the rage really rendered me incapable of coping, right? Incapable of coping with those harmful things. So let's get back to how any of this fits into a channel about atheism. Yeah, this does go back to that Halloween 2020 with my in-laws. My in-laws have been able to navigate the world in a less extreme way because they live in Southern California. You know, they live right outside San Diego, which is, you know, a right-wing-ish part of Southern California, but it's really different from fundamentalists in, say, like Oklahoma or Alabama. But my in-laws are still a byproduct of the mega churches and other fundamentalist characteristics. They still encouraged proselytization, which is something I find personally revolting, and they encourage missionary work, which is something I find culturally revolting. But honestly, I do not mean to pick on my in-laws. I want to make that clear, so I feel guilty for it seeming that way. The reason I'm talking about them is because my ability to get along with them between 2012 when I met them and now, it's like a roadmap of how rage has played a part in my inability to cope with living in this world with diverse people, diverse belief systems. When I met them, we were able to get along just fine as a family. I was able to visit them. I visited by myself to ask for approval for getting married to their daughter. Things really changed later, and they changed gradually. Really, the election of Donald Trump, and even more so, the campaign that preceded that started to erode my relationship with my in laws, which I would say, that campaign began with the man calling my cultural heritage, the people, rapists. That was the way he announced his candidacy, his bid for candidacy. And they loved that. And since that nightmare cycle up to the nightmare cycle of the 2020 election, through the pandemic, that administration's absolutely disastrous handling of the COVID-19 pandemic through 2020, the vitriolic and absolutely racist responses to the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in that wake, the wake of George Floyd and others that we saw at that time, the consequences of the Supreme Court picks, those Supreme Court picks who have a lifetime in office, the inclusion of a very likely rapist in Brett Kavanaugh, who I will say, as an aside, that my mother-in-law very vocally supported. All of that conspired to erode and then just set aflame my ability to relate to my in-laws. They serve as a good analogy for theism and theists in general. They're one example that was close to me, who I can cite. Up until lockdown, my in-laws were people who had like little or no notion of boundaries, and at first I was kind of amused by that. I found it kind of funny, even if it annoyed my partner. They could show up to our house unannounced and uninvited, for example. They would constantly ask about what church we were going to pick and all that kind of nonsense. They would force us to say grace before every meal with our hands held. And of course, they would tell us they were praying for us every time, which I absolutely despise. One slight benefit of lockdown was we made it perfectly clear that we were sheltering in place. We were unable to host any guests. And for those reasons, we didn't see my in-laws for most of 2020 until the Halloween later that year. And I have to give them credit that they listened. I have to give them credit that when we did see them on Halloween, they did agree to wear masks, which I'm sure that is something they did not entirely want to do. But, Halloween comes around, and there we all were on our porch, ensuring we stayed outside. We all wore masks. It was safe for my daughter, it was safe for us. But it was barely a week before the election of 2020. And it was caused that I already had a ton of anxiety. And here is where the first of my couple of years of breakdowns happened. Of course, the catalyst for that breakdown, how it started, was talk of the election. I'm sure that that is no surprise to anyone. And of course, it was my in-laws who brought it up. No one in my family had any intention of going over that topic in any particular verbal terrain. And I wish I had a clear memory of exactly what was said, exactly anything about it, other than remembering some, clear moral indignation that anybody in our house would ever cast a vote for Joe Biden, even in the environment we had been going through with the global disaster that the 45th president put us under COVID, everything that was going on. And still, we're getting kind of looked down on because we would not vote for that idiot person. Yeah, again, I don't remember specifics because it was a traumatic time. All I do know is that at some point I was not on that porch anymore. At some point, I walked away from my house, and we lived kind of at the foot of Cowles Mountain. So this big, rocky, dusty mountain in San Diego County. And I walked from my house to Cowles Mountain and climbed to the peak and found myself at the peak. Uh, this peak is largely made up of dust and large boulders, and you can plummet from one of those top boulders down and down onto groups of other sharp, jagged boulders, which were perfectly designed by our intelligent designer to smash any bodies who should happen to fall or jump from above. So I can't say for any real certainty that my intention was to jump. Um, I can suppose it. I can suppose it with significance. But what I can say with certainty was that when I woke up and found myself sitting atop the mountain on one of the higher boulders where they have a plaque congratulating you for getting to the top, um, I remember with certainty that my biggest conscious feeling was disappointment. Was disappointment that I hadn't jumped, with disappointment that I was still sitting here, that I still had to go back down and face the world. It was disappointment I hadn't jumped. And despite all that, I still remembered I had a family with a kid sitting at home in the valley at the bottom of the foot of the mountain. And so I made the trip on foot back down. And that was the first of many dissociative episodes that happened to me between Halloween 2020 and May 2022, which is when I had the last major dissociative episode. If anyone wonders, by the way, how I could continue to have those episodes when the incumbent lost in 2020, Joe Biden won the election, one only has to remember the January 6th insurrection, as well as the minor slaps on the hand that anybody, including those who got jail sentences, minor slaps on the hand, I still say, for any of the perpetrators of that insurrection of January 2021, and most of all, the continued support of those perpetrators, those insurrectionists, by many people in power still, at local level, at state level, and at federal level. And of course, that losing incumbent is running again now that we are in 2024 and running on a platform of pardoning those people still, as well as constantly referring to how much he's going to jail anybody who's opposed him. This real disturbing fascist rhetoric. Yeah, so I'm still having problems. Joe Biden winning was not a solve. And also, Joe Biden, not really my first choice anyway. So anyway, I digress. That's a whole different conversation. I don't want to get into that. The point here is that the vast majority of the reasons for the election of the 40, 45th president, the vast majority of why this guy got in office was through the direct efforts of white evangelicals. They had the power in districting to help district. They had the power to be the catalyst for gerrymandering, and most importantly, in making the election of extreme right wing candidates, both local and federal, part of their religious doctrines. That is true. One thing you can say about evangelicals, white evangelicals in the South specifically, maybe less than 30, maybe a little bit more than 25% of our overall population here in the United States, but they are an extremely well-oiled machine. They are well organized, and they make voting and political outreach part of their religious doctrine. So they wield a disproportionate amount of power as voters, as members of the constituency. And so that's why religion and atheism are part of all of this and why I'm talking about it so much. It was the evangelical vote that resulted in having a Brett Kavanaugh. It was the evangelical vote that resulted in a Neil Gorsuch or an Amy Coney Barrett. Of course, what I'm talking about now is the Supreme Court. Um, and the number of terrible things that have happened through their appointment because of the 45th president, like, of course, the obvious ones, like the overturn of Roe versus Wade, the overturn of the Chevron doctrine, and those are just two of many right-wing actions within just the last couple of years that are a major problem. And by the way, I'm not going to take any claims seriously that these actions by the Supreme Court of the United States are completely separate from religious dogma. It's just part of our process working. I've heard people say that. That's nonsense. You know it's nonsense. It's said in bad faith, no pun intended. Don't give it to me. Don't listen to it. If it's said in the comments, it'll probably be just deleted. I'm sorry. I will, again, I said in the first episode, some believer comments will be engaged with when they're said with thoughtfulness and intelligence and integrity. But some things like that, you know you're lying. Appointments to the Supreme Court are religiously motivated and part of a crumbling of the separation of church and state. It's just true. It's part of the current efforts for Christian nationalism as well. So these things I'm talking about, they're all partial lists, right? These are partial lists of examples of enraging things, back to that rage word, that have happened as a direct result of the election in 2016. They are enraging things that continue to affect our country beyond the 2020 election. And were both set in place and continually celebrated by churches as a part of their worship services. So all of this it's a current vat of lighter fluid for my rage. It's something that makes it hard for me to keep the fires down. So that's another point I wanted to make here, is that dealing with rage is not an ending thing. This is something that keeps going, right? It's something that is a lifelong challenge. And knowing that and being aware of that, I think, is a helpful thing. Let's talk about the corrupting power of rage. In order to do that, you have to start at a place from before the rage took over. If something corrupts, you have to go to a pre-corrupted state. So you see, for me, Atheism, it's not just a rejection of God. Atheism is not just a rejection of religion. It's a rejection of harm. It's a rejection of harm that I feel religion very directly plays against the world. During college, part of my English major included classical literature. So in that time, I thoroughly read the Judeo-Christian Bible. We're talking about the King James Version explicitly, in most cases, the KJV, along with the Apocrypha that often accompanied it, and copious notes, handwritten. This was an educational exercise in my undergrad. Read the Apocrypha, read the Quran, the Book of Latter-day Saints. I had a little hardcover copy of. I read the L. Ron Hubbard Scientology book. And of course, I was in Greece for a while. I studied the pantheistic writings of Greek, Roman, North religions, read about Buddhism and Hindu writings. And I think it's important here that I say I didn't specify those later things as mythology, but the Judeo-Christians as not mythology. All of these I read under the intention that it was all mythology. It was all stories we told each other to help try to understand the world. And it was pretty majorly intense studying that I was doing while finishing college, really between the years of 2005 and 2007. Cut forward to about 2014. I remember one time we were moving and my wife found my Bible. So my King James Version Bible, it had the Apocrypha in it. It was this huge hardcore thing, and it was crammed with margin notes and pieces of paper all crumpled with my handwritten notes from reading it. And my wife was so shocked, so surprised. She was like, "You read all this?" So confused. And she had done nothing like that despite growing up Baptist, despite being a missionary abroad for the Baptists. This was not a practice that she had done. And so I told her, I was like, yeah, reading about Jesus for me was very similar, no greater, no worse to reading Ovid's Metamorphosis about Perseus. It's very similar to me. They're stories to me. I don't think being not real makes them less important as narrative fiction to the history of our lives on this planet, trying to understand this crazy world. And by that point in her journey, there was something she really made sense to her. It was something she got. So let's go back to that pandemic. That shows you pre-insane me. And during the pandemic, I had reached a point where my anger toward theism, right? It wasn't just a reaction to the ills of the world anymore. It became part of who I was. It was part of my identity. My anger wasn't just about theism now. Horribly, my anger was against theists, right? So I would say that that is like a key difference, that change of a single letter. It causes all the corruption, or it's a source of corruption, of rage. Knowing theism, knowing that harm can come from theism, is largely a conceptual exercise. It's a disagreement. Hating theism is a challenge. It can be harmful, but it's a challenge. Hating theists, though, it is an inhumanity. So by the time summer 2020 rolled around, and remember summer 2020 with the idiots that the 45th rather, sorry, the 40th president was also an idiot, but the 45th president appointed the idiot press secretaries to talk about the pandemic, the insanity about drinking bleach, the constant fighting against masking, calling COVID just the flu. My rage was like a screaming kettle of blood, boiling and boiling and getting louder and louder. And any joy that I could feel from anything, and I was such a joyful person. Music, reading, films. I could easily find joy. Anyone who knew me would tell you this. I was a joyful person. Gradually through this experience, finding joy left me. Later, I would be diagnosed with anhedonia, which that literally it's a mental condition about not being able to find joy. It was really helpful to be diagnosed that way and have a treatment that addressed that. But I didn't have treatment at that time. Joy left me in favor of rage. And when joy is gone, but rage is still there, you become inhuman and treat others with inhumanity, sometimes overtly, sometimes more covertly. So here's a big thing, that summer before the Halloween dissociation, I did find a glimpse of happiness, and that was from the Herman Cain Award subreddit on Reddit. Do you not know what that is? Let me explain. On July 30th of 2020, the ardent MAGA Republican COVID denier Herman Cain died. And what did he die from? I bet you can guess. He died from COVID. See, even now you can see my kind of glee at this. It's inhumane. I acknowledge the inhumanity, but I can't, corruption and poison, it dies hard. Um, so September of that same year, 2020, on Reddit, they created the Herman Cain Award. I bet you can guess what that was all about. I would venture to say, my own personal definition is that the Herman Cain Award celebrates people who deny COVID, who are very vocal about not masking and that COVID is just the flu. And it celebrates their deaths when they get COVID themselves. They die from what they ardently denied. So, yeah, the people who developed the Herman Cain Award probably wouldn't put it that way. But I can say that I personally acted on those posts with both elation and celebration. And I know a lot of the people who were on there did as well. And I want to say this is not a point of current pride, but it is as things were. An average post that you would see on the Herman Cain Award thing would be like a collection of evidence, right? It would be all of this person's posts on their social media, on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, with all of the things that you can imagine. You've all seen it before. COVID's just the flu, masks or this. Oftentimes there will be some kind of conspiracy theorist element like, the vaccine, any vaccines would be an attempt to control us and exploit, whatever, it doesn't matter. Here's the thing, too, though. Almost every one of those posts would have a religious element to it. Like it would be about praying to Jesus or some kind of biblical, it would be a Christian specific religious element to it, by the way. Prayer verses, Bible verses, all things like that. The tirades against maskers or people who wore masks or people who were locking down would be cruel. There's a lot of cruelty in a lot of those posts. And yeah, to say that these were not religious in nature is being willfully ignorant. These were definitely from people influenced by fundamentalist Christianity, almost 100%. And then the last post would be either pictures of them in the hospital or their family asking for thoughts and prayers, or that, it would be a snippet from their obituaries, and that would be like the justice, the way the Herman Cain Award kind of presented itself was like, see what happens. And it sounds pretty terrible, right? I'm not sure. I haven't been on that in a long time. I don't know if it's still going on or if people are still finding Herman Cain Award recipients to this point. I guess it's still going on, but I will say that for the length of summer 2022 all the way through to maybe summer of 2021, probably a full year, that subreddit was the only place I could really remember having a genuine smile on my face. That inhumanity you're hearing me talk about is the gift of rage. And it started with a genuine hope for a better world. It started with a genuine hope for greater love between human beings, for one person to another. And that's where rage took it. Following my first dissociative episode on Halloween of 2020, I found myself atop Cowles Mountain, wishing I had jumped. I decided to go no contact with my in-laws. I haven't spoken to them since, really. Um, it wasn't just hate or rage or anything like that, but going no contact with them was out of genuine concern for my own mental health and that I would still be here with for my daughter. And for that reason, I can't say that I completely regret going no contact with them. But at this point, I've gotten healthier to the point that I'm saddened by the reality of it, that things couldn't be different. And it wasn't really just them, it was all theists, engaging with people. I had to just stay away. So the ability to connect with people became less. And I won't say, since I'm sure some people wonder, is like, oh, you just hate people with different opinions. This is different than a different opinion. It's a little bit complicated. It wasn't just a different, it was people who specifically want to rob others of their civil rights because of their religion. Those are the kind of people that I had to go no contact with. Any conversation, by the way, about faith, any conversation about any of this felt like I was defending not just my beliefs or how I thought, but felt like I was defending my pain. It felt like I was defending who I was. It felt like I was defending what my struggles have been like my whole life. And it made that rage that I felt feel justified. And there is no rage like a justified rage, right? No hate like a righteous hate. It didn't take long before that rage grew. And when the rage grows, the dissociative episodes grow because the depression deepens. And the depression deepened to the point where those dissociative episodes, suddenly waking up somewhere, and I don't know how I got there, they increased in frequency. Suddenly I would wake up. One time I woke up and I was laying down in the middle of the street, and not just a street, but a major thoroughfare in San Diego with cars swerving around me. May 2022, that became so serious that my partner drove me with my daughter in the car with us to the hospital. That anger didn't come from nowhere. A lot of it stemmed from personal experiences, of course, right? Especially around depression, mental health struggles, the trauma that led to ending my film festival. I want to mention that for a reason, because there are reasons and elements surrounding the death of my film festival that I'm not going to go into in this episode or in this show. I don't know yet. But the big thing, the big reason for my film festival ending was I lost my ability to cope, right? I lost my ability to cope with just being alive, to cope with living at its most basic. And when you can't live at its most basic, then the work, the drive that goes into creating something as all consuming as a film festival, it just becomes impossible. It becomes impossible. That festival was something I poured everything into, my identity, and losing something so extreme like that, it's so much that I'm still trying to figure it out. And I started a memoir about being a film festival director, largely just to try to parse out that whole situation. And during that time, I was already grappling with suicidal thoughts, of course, breakdowns that were happening. When the festival collapsed in 2022, at the end of 2021, really, but I thought maybe we would do an April version in 2022 that never came to fruition. So its actual last death was in 2022. And the depression compounded. It deepened to a point of extreme what's despair. I think despair is the right word. And in many ways, that despair turned itself to rage, right? Because rage was a feeling I could understand. And I aimed a lot of that anger at the evangelical right. In late spring 2022, this is when I thought, April was when I thought maybe we'll do the festival then. But of course, in May of 2022, no festival and Roe versus Wade was overturned. And it was a larger affront, that rage. It was an affront more than just to bodily autonomy, but also individual privacy. It's ultimately a privacy thing, Roe versus Wade. But of course, we won't talk about that. I don't want to get on a high horse that I was like, oh, it's not just about abortion, it's about this, that, and the other. Let's be honest, my own rage was about bodily autonomy, about the harm to bodily autonomy. My own rage was every time I looked into the eyes of my 4-year-old daughter. She was 4 at the time, she's 6 now. In my 4-year-old little girl, and I saw with startling and fire felt clarity that in the official stance of the United States per the Supreme Court and honestly agreed on by my in-laws, by my daughter's grandparents, was that she is a second-class citizen. And that rage led to the last time I had a severe dissociative episode. And it landed me, I think, 72 hours in the hospital, in suicide watch. For anyone who has done that, it is a hellraiser like hell. It is a hell. Being in suicide watch sucks. It's boring. It's miserable. You've got crazy ass roommates. It's no fun. Hopefully, by this point, it makes sense to know why letting go of rage matters. So, why let go of rage? After all, isn't righteous anger justified? Maybe to a point. Here's what I've learned so far, many years later. The rage that I felt was only hurting me. It was a constant weight on my heart. It hurt my chest. I mean, hurt physically, hurt physiologically, hurt. I've gained a lot of weight. I will go grocery shopping and just sob uncontrollably in the parking lot or on the dirty ass gross for no reason. And it's all from this kind of stuff. And it kept me in a place of defensiveness if I did have to talk to someone and I couldn't engage with people in any kind of meaningful way. I ended up having to take a family leave because I couldn't focus at work. At this point where I'm working 100% remotely, you really need to focus to work remotely. So it blocked me from healing in some pretty severe ways. And rage was at the center. It was at the center of this. But I do want to make it clear that if you let go of rage, then it's not about excusing when people are doing harmful things, right? It's not making an excuse for the evangelical right or Christian nationalists who I do think are harming our country. It's not about ignoring injustice. But when I talk about letting go of my rage, it's about looking at my anger, looking at my rage outside of it so that it does not become me. I am me. And that is something like when I'm happy, I feel happy for a little bit and then I'm sad again. The rage should be the same. I'll feel rage for a little bit and then I'll be not rageful anymore and I can go about things more constructively. And the reality is, you can't change other people's like deeply held beliefs in one conversation. Some people can change. I've been watching, I mentioned this in the other video, people like Eve Was Framed as a great talker who was an ex-evangelical, deeply steeped in things like purity culture and all of that, who has changed. So it's not that change is impossible, but you can't force that change. People go through that journey on their own, and it can take a very long time. But you can change yourself, how you respond to things that annoy you, or terrify you, or irk you, or piss you off. Letting go of that rage, if I had been able to do it earlier, I wouldn't have abandoned my loved ones, my closest friends. Those text messages that are hundreds deep, the appeals to concern that I not only ignored but never even opened. Everybody I left My partner calls a lot of those people the San Diego casualties, right? But it's more than just San Diego casualties. It is worldwide casualties of people who I love and have cared about and have met over the years as a film festival director, and I suddenly cut off all contact. And when I went no contact, it wasn't just with theists. I became so embroiled in my rage that I didn't want that to touch people I loved, so they didn't have to be theists anymore. It was everyone. I was a turtle in my shell for every other human being, and that became even worse than the lockdown. I was the extrovert who forced myself into introversion, and the result was only pain for me. The result was only pain for people who cared about me. Uh, and now time has gone by, and it feels harder to renew those bonds. The longer time goes by, the harder it is to try to reach out now. I feel like guilty. So the rage gets replaced with sadness, and life continues going on, and eventually you fear that it'll be too late. And that's what I'm feeling right now. So I want to be clear. I'm not letting go of my commitment to being atheist. I am atheist through and through. I am heathen through and through. But I'm letting go, or trying to let go more and more of the rage that once fueled my interactions with theism. And sometimes that's hard, right? There was that CNN article just a couple of days ago. I made a short about all the theists at the Supreme Court, and it's so hard and rage. Um, it's been a long journey. It will continue to be a long journey, but I believe it's necessary. It's necessary for my own well being. It's necessary for my relationship with my partner and my daughter and my parents and everything in between. If you are dealing with something similar, if all of this sounds familiar to you, maybe I'll encourage you. Maybe I'm not the best person in this point to do encouragement, but I will. I'll encourage you to reflect on how much of your energy is being drained by holding on to anger, to rage, to these feelings that should feel like they're just feelings, but feel like they're more becoming you. Think about those and look at them more as something temporary. So I think that's about it for episode 2 and the corruption of rage. Join me next week. I will do an episode 3, and it might be a little bit of a surprise. I'm going to talk subcultures. So subcultures, for me, have been the replacement for religion. As a Mexican who lost a connection to heritage, and then who became atheist and lost a connection to that part of heritage, I largely spent my teen and younger years immersed in subcultures as my kind of replacement, my place to find community. And we're talking like punk rock, metal, horror. That so I'm going to talk about the genesis of how young me eventually became a film festival programmer, a film festival founder and director, and also someone who spent some time living in a van with punk rock bands. And so until then, I hope you get out of bed with a clear head and a clear heart. And I'll see you next time.